All right, let's do the initial vote. Initial vote says red, blue, orange, green in almost equal proportions. So this is either a really good question or a really bad one. Let's find out by having you guys talk about it for about a minute. OK, I think this is a good question because it asks you to sort of push beyond sort of all the specific things that have been presented in lecture. So let's do another vote here. Another vote on which method or methods. Oh, interesting. There's been a substantial movement towards blue. And I'm not talking about the Congress. I'm talking about just the answers. Haha. Yeah. OK. OK, let's go through the answer. So what's the key to this question? The key to this question is remembering that if we're going to create a new review and associate it to a movie, somewhere in its life before it gets created, we got to be able to assign the movie ID field. Right? So we need one or more ways of doing that. That at the time the review is created, that field's going to get assigned. So what about this first choice, review create? Well, I'm just passing an explicit value for the ID of the movie that I want to be owned. Right? So this is just like any other active record create operation. I can just pass explicit values for every single attribute. And movie ID is just an attribute. It happens to be an attribute that plays this special role in managing the association, but you can assign to it. So the first one would work. It's not terribly idiomatic, because you have choices like, for example, what happens if I say reviews.build? Well, because build basically has a way of reaching back to the owning object, right? What is m.reviews? M.reviews is an object able to do the query of which reviews belong to this movie. Remember, the queries are lazy, so the query doesn't happen right away. But it's an object that could do that query, which means the object must know the ID of movie. Otherwise, there'd be no way for it to do the query. So what build does is it gives you, it's like new, it gives you a blank object you can fill in, except that the foreign key field has already been filled in for you. And it exists for exactly the reason you'd think. It's to make it more idiomatic, right? It's so that you don't have to do the first one where you're naming the foreign key explicitly. What's so bad about naming the foreign key explicitly? In many cases, it's not the worst evil in the world. But as I mentioned, you might be working, for example, with a legacy database where the foreign key fields don't have nice names like movie_ID because they were built to work with some other system. And you might not have the option of renaming them. So in those cases, the active record association module gives you a bunch of options so that you can override how the fields are named that manage the foreign keys. And things like build will still do the right thing. They'll still honor your weird, non-standard foreign key names. What about this one? So again, what's the idea here? What is m.reviews? Well, it is an object that knows what m's ID is. That's for darn sure. And that means that one can imagine redefining the less method, which is sort of append onto the end of an enumeration, such that part of what it does is as this review is created, right, review.new with potatoes5 has no foreign key in it. But one could certainly imagine defining this instance method so that it essentially fills in that foreign key on the way in. And that's actually just what happens. So when you use associations, this is one of the other methods that gets overridden so that when you try to add a review on for an existing movie, the right thing happens. It does more or less what you would expect, right? And it does it by essentially using dynamic rewriting of the methods. So all of these methods, blue would have been the correct answer. All of these methods will actually do it. Most people prefer to use the middle one because it separates the building and the saving into two steps. You can control them a little bit better. But the third one would work just as well. And I don't recommend the first one if you have any choice. So let's talk about this since I see there's some questions about it.
So does the m.save sort of propagate in the same way that m.destroy can destroy its children? M.save then saves its...
So the question is, in the same way that m.destroy can destroy the owned objects, which is something we actually haven't talked about just yet, but we will, is it also the case that m.save will sort of save the reviews associated with a movie? That's a really good question, and the interesting answer is yes. And the reason I say it's an interesting answer is because if you think about it for a moment, when I'm creating a new review to be associated with an existing movie, what changes occur to the row representing that movie in the movies table? Hint, it's a trick. No changes, right? The only changes is in the new review, I've got to have a foreign key pointing back to that movie. So it seems counterintuitive that I would be calling save on the movie object if the movie object in the database doesn't actually have to change. But in fact, what you just asked is correct. What actually happens is that when you do a save on an object that owns other objects, it triggers saves of all of the owned objects that have been changed or created. Right? And again, why is it that even though the movie itself is not changing, why does save work that way when you do it on the movie? because the thing we're trying to get with this abstraction is the illusion that the movie is the owning object, so saving it feels like it ought to save all the owned objects, right? It should sort of save its children. So this is provided because it provides less surprise for the programmer. And for the same reason here, here in this case, what's the difference between the second and third example? In the second example, I created a new review, right? So the value of R is a thing that is a review object, and then I'm saving that review object directly. In this case, the value of M is a movie, but when I save it, all of the owned objects, including ones that were saved or created or updated since I loaded it, they also get saved as a side effect. And by the way, because I've used the dangerous, the bang version of save, that means that if anything goes wrong in saving the owned objects, it'll fail as well. Right? So just like doing a save with a bang will throw an exception if the object is invalid, when I save bang the owning side of an association, if errors occur when saving the owned side, those errors will cause exceptions as well. Really good question. There was another, yes?
So basically, before you say that a review also belongs to some kind of moviegoers, how come we don't see anything?
Oh, in this example, I was just focusing on the Movies and Reviews Association. So yeah, in this question, I didn't want you to worry about the moviegoer association. However, had the question included a constraint about making sure the review was also owned by a moviegoer, then we would have had, and that's an interesting case, right? Because we could say mreviews.build, that will fill in the foreign key for the review, or we could have said, moviegoers. If we had a moviegoer, we could say moviegoer.reviews.build. That would fill in the foreign key for moviegoers, but we actually need both foreign keys. So in that case, somewhere along the line, you would end up having to fill in one of them explicitly yourself. And in a minute, when we talk about how you do controller actions that manage objects and associations, we'll see how you do that.